Guys, welcome to kind of a curveball episode of the Big Sky Podcast Network Power Rankings, presented by Tubbs Club, meaning presented by Snake River Stampede Canadian Whiskey. I'm your host, Brian Marceau. Hey, this is the podcast network show itself has been a little bit atypical this year. In full disclosure, mostly that has to do with just my own schedule. Patty's not here this week. It's just me. Because of that, I'm choosing to run this episode a little bit differently. And look, we're halfway through the Big Sky season, guys. You know, we've played eight. Your team's played 8 games if you have not yet had a bye. So we're kind of closing in on the point where I don't think it's worth talking about the lower teams quite as much because, like, hey, what are you going to learn about Cal Poly, right? They're not any good. So is that going to change this week? No. Unless Northern Colorado, who did not play this week, strings together a handful of wins, I don't think it's worth paying that much attention. So we'll focus a little bit less on the entire conference power rankings, a little bit more the week that was, the week to come, and then based off our rankings, talk a little bit about some of the stories that I think matter in the Big Sky Conference. So with that said, the power rankings themselves they're voted on by people like me from Tubbs of the Club, people like Mike Nugent from Grizz Fans, Sammy Akem from Skyline, Colton Nuanez sometimes from Skyline. It's just all the people that I know best who cover the conference as a whole. That's who votes on these. And then look, we get our numbers 12 through 1. I'm going to run through some of those numbers faster, but hey, let's talk first about the week that was. We're depending on who you follow. Your team either played their third or fourth Big Sky Conference game on Saturday, and we're getting some pretty clear kind of gaps in the conference, some groupings in the conference. And that's just why I think that's why I'm choosing to focus less on the rankings this time, even though, hey, we'll still talk about the power rankings. So look, this week, the basic games, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking groups because, hey, there were five games this week, right? 2 teams are on bye. There's only 3 Big Sky Conference games next week. So like essentially like most teams are going to become even with how the bye weeks go. But this coming week, it's a little bit weird with truly half the conference is on bye. And that's just how it is. So there's only 3 games to even really pay attention about heading into this week. So I think this is not an awful midterm, kind of check-in for how the conference is going. But hey, what happened in week 4? Well, Idaho had a very I talked about this on the Tubbs of Club episode. Idaho played one of the weirdest games I've ever seen. Beat Cal Poly 34-29. They're down 14-6 at halftime. Outscored Cal Poly 21-2 in the third quarter. The game felt like it was garbage time while you're in Moscow, but then Idaho gave up a touchdown, then had a fumble return 80 yards for another touchdown. Suddenly you have the box score tells you it was a game. And hey, it was a 1-score game, right? But for the lived experience of that game was for most second half, the game was pretty much over. But hey, so that's Idaho. They pick up a win over Cal Poly. Idaho State, NAU play a back and forth affair. And big news for NAU is quarterback Ty Pennington, who was hurt against Idaho, then missed the Montana game. He was back, and Ty Pennington, by the way, relatively raucous atmosphere for Northern Arizona. They beat Idaho State at home 30-26. Pennington, he was back. It didn't look like he was 100%, but did throw for 265 yards and rush for 88 yards. We actually will talk Idaho State a little bit later because I feel like the Bengals are one of the bottom half teams that are worth your time. Montana State murdered Portland State like everyone would expect, 44-14. Tommy Mellott passes 239 yards. Scott Trey Humphrey rushes for 160 yards. There's not much to talk about there right now, or that game itself. I don't think that talking about that game matters that much. Montana State, very good, beat the shit out of Portland State. There you go. UC Davis and Eastern played a back and forth affair. And for the last handful of years, in the same way that Davis has had Idaho's number, Eastern has had Davis's number in the last handful of years. So this was circled last week as a game to really watch for. Davis, well, if you didn't know, Davis is one of 2 teams undefeated in Big Sky play. So, which by the way, that's Montana State and UC Davis both sit at 4-0. Davis picks up the win. It was a tight one. They hold on 48-38, high scoring affair Land Larson rushing for 182 yards. Miles Hastings passes for 329 yards. We'll hit a little bit more takeaways on that later. And probably the wildest game was a game on Tubs of the Club and on the podcast network show last week. I said the matchup between Sacramento State and Weber State is a huge deal because whoever loses that game, their playoff hopes are completely done. And both of those teams are talented. Both of those teams, their own staff, their own players, and their own fan bases probably believed that game would have implications, but in a different way before the season started, because both Sac State and Weber State, they're battling it out right now for who is the most disappointing on the season. Sam Buffington in the comments section. Brian, Sam, good to see you here. Running things a little bit different today, Sam. So in double overtime, Sacramento State holds on for a 51-48 win. This is the third Weber loss attributable to special teams miscues or just self-inflicted gunshot wounds from the Wildcats. Like the reason it's a 3-point gap is in the second overtime, Weber missed a chip shot to send it into a third overtime. So for Sac State, the Zach Schreiner 36-yard field goal in second overtime was the difference. And look, hey, this is just the Weber State thing. And look, maybe that is where we can start because we're going through the striding the conference. I think that the Weber State and Sac State is a great delineation of now, because Sac State won. If you're below Sac State, your playoff hopes they're gone for this season. That they're just off the table. You're playing for something else. You're playing for the development. Now, I will say, I hate it when people talk college athletics as though it's like a Philadelphia 76ers, a process type of thing. Because look, guys have short careers. The season's not that long. People transfer all the time. So like cohesive program building is different. So no season's ever truly over, but after certain losses, seasons do become about different things. And for Weber State, the season no longer is about the playoffs. So that's kind of devastating if you're a Wildcat to think about that. But just to touch the power rankings for a second, then talk what I think is interesting about different teams. So based on our voting, here's your rankings out. We have number 12, Northern Colorado, number 11, Cal Poly, number 10, Portland State. Those three not shocking whatsoever, even though Portland State beat Idaho State last week. It was a tight one, but still, I'm okay with that Mendoza line at number 10 if Portland State's below it. Your next tier, and now these are teams that I think are interesting one way or another, but the playoffs are done. You've got number 9, Idaho State, number 8, Eastern Washington, number 7, Weber State. Now we have 6 teams remaining. I will say at this point, I think it's pretty clear to understand the Big Sky. There's probably 4 playoff teams. It seems Sacramento State would have to really kick things into gear to have a chance at getting a 5th Big Sky Conference team in the playoffs. It's not completely out of the question. But this year, I think we're more likely looking at 4 Big Sky teams in the playoffs. We'll hit those 4 teams in a second. But just to finish out the rankings, we've got number 6, Sacramento State, number 5, Northern Arizona. And then these are the 4 teams who are kind of brain dead looking at playoff spots. We have number 4, Idaho, number 3, Montana. Idaho and Montana in a virtual tie. I could explain our point system, but it's not worth doing it. Those 2 teams there is a minuscule difference between the point totals for those 2. And then your top 2 in the conference, UC Davis, number 2, Montana State, number 1. Montana State was a unanimous number 1, UC Davis a unanimous number 2. Not shocking to just talk standings, because one of the things that can be kind of wild to me with how the Big Sky Conference season goes, with how much how your schedule starts and how it finishes really matters. It can be pretty easy to lose track of who's actually doing what in conference play. So at the top of the conference, Montana State sits at they're 4-0 in conference, 8-0 on the season. UC Davis, they're tied for first place in conference, 4-0. Then they're 7-1 on the year. Montana, who was on bye this last week, they're 2-1. Then a slew of 2-2 teams. We have Idaho, NAU, and Weber State all sit at 2-2. But hey, out of conference stuff dictates part of why I reference playoff things for both Northern Arizona and Weber State. Then we have there's no team with no conference win, which, hey, I don't know, kind of interesting. I'm not going to run through much more of the standings, but some teams that I think are relevant to track. Eastern, Sacramento State, And Northern Arizona, I can't believe I brought up Northern Colorado. They're 1-2. They're 1-2 temporarily. Idaho State is higher than their overall record would indicate at 1-3, but we'll touch on that a little bit. So the first thing that I want to hit on is with what we just said, the way the conference is breaking out, your top four, Montana State, UC Davis, Montana, Idaho, they're the teams that you're looking at for playoffs, making the playoffs, or they're playing for playoff seeding. Right now, you for a fact would say Montana State and UC Davis, their schedule right now is looking more about how they can sort where they're going to be in the playoffs and how many home games they're going to be holding on to throughout the playoffs. Montana and Idaho. Montana, because of OOC, might be a little bit ahead of Idaho here as far as like a shoe in for sure in the playoffs. But Idaho played a very rough first half of the schedule. Their next four games, they've got Eastern Washington, Portland State, Weber State, Idaho State. So they're against all bottom half of the conference teams. Now, a couple of those are on the frisky side, depending on what matchups actually dictate. Like, hey, Eastern's not nothing, and Weber State, they feel like they could beat anyone and lose to anyone. The Weber State team that hung 48 on Sacramento State and pushed the Hornets to double overtime the week before, scored 17 against Northern Colorado, and that's why that team is who they are. So now I want to look at I want to talk a couple topics here. Now, before we do that, though, show sponsor Snake River Stampede Canadian Whiskey, one of the best buys you can get in Idaho State liquor stores. $26.95 for the Snake River Stampede. That's their entry level double barrel finish, first fill bourbon, then finish in Oloroso sherry casks. If you want to celebrate like a bigger win, you can buy their 1915 small batch that's aged an additional 2 years, and it's double barrel finishes, first fill bourbon, and then it's finished in ex-Canadian rye whiskey casks. No matter which one you go for, you can't go wrong. Grab yourself some Snake River today. So if I'm looking at the Big Sky Podcast Network rankings, and someone asked me, let's pretend Sam in the comments section is asking me, hey, Marceau, of those bottom, your team 7 through 12, who to you is the most interesting, or which of those teams do I think is going to have the biggest footprint in how the rest of the season goes? I am looking kind of squarely at both. The grouping itself is Weber State, Eastern Washington, and Idaho State. Those three teams I do feel are interesting. I'm going to talk about Idaho State for a second because Weber, I think we know who Weber is. I think Weber is, they're terrible on special teams. They're a good team. They've got they have 3 losses by a combined 10 points. So Weber is a good football team in the midst of a bad year. On the season, the Wildcats, they are not the same Weber State team that you might think that a lot of people are going to have come to mind for the last few years. I mean, I know Mickey Mental, he's not in his first year as a coach, so like the team's getting more of his DNA, that matters. Worth noting, Weber State is scoring 40.8 points a game. Now, they've got 2 games they scored. I mean, they scored 55 against Montana 2 weeks ago, 17 against UNC after that, then 48 in overtime against Sacramento State. That's 2 pretty big outings. So the Wildcats are putting things together on the offensive side of the ball, and they're not a catastrophe defensively. I mean, I think this is one where the jury is in. The Wildcats are better offensively than you might think. And defensively, they're not a slouch. Honestly, if the Wildcats had not shot themselves in the foot 3 separate times, we'd be talking about Weber as a playoff team. And if you're sitting here listening, thinking, hey, well, what do you mean the Wildcats shot themselves in the foot 3 different times? Well, the Weber State sits at 3-5 on the season, 2-2 in Big Sky play. Here, honestly, I misspoke. The Wildcats have 4 just devastating losses. A 1-point loss to Lamar, where Weber did not kick a field goal late in the game, but maybe Mickey Mental understood how the kicking game was. Then 2 weeks later, they've got a 2-point loss again at home against McNeese, another game completely given away. Then the loss to Northern Colorado, famously 2 fumbles in the end zone for Weber State, where either of those, finish out, that the game is clearly over. And then Sacramento State. Look, Sac State's a talented team as well, but that's another misfield. It's a missed field goal, took that game away from Weber. So honestly, Weber, forget what I said earlier. Weber's the most intriguing team to me of that grouping of Weber State, Eastern, Idaho State. And it's because Weber they should be a playoff team. If they were a team that did not get in the way of themselves, we'd be talking about the Wildcats as a playoff caliber team. Incredible to me, the way Weber is able to throw away so much. That's 4 of the 5 losses the Wildcats have. I think Weber fans reasonably could say, hey, this team could easily be sitting at 7-1 if the Wildcats could figure out how to not get in their own way. The downside is, well, the Wildcats have not figured out how to get out of their own way. And there's a point of reference here. Sacramento State is a good defensive team. They're a team that has been able to bother a lot of opposing teams. And depending on the matchup, Sacramento State's been able to pile up a lot of TFLs. Well, Weber put up 527 yards against Sacramento State. The downside is they also gave up 544. That's how you lose that game. The point being, Weber State's not talent free. I mean, look, hey, Damon Bankson he's one of the 2 or 3 best running backs in the Big Sky. Rushed for 234 yards against Weber State in a loss. Richie Munoz was a little bit more productive than, certainly last week against North Colorado. Throws 3 touchdowns, 211 yards on the season. So I'm going to quit talking about Weber for a second. This just say Wildcats are not a talent-free team, guys. And if you are matched up against the Wildcats, like, hey, Idaho has a game against Weber in a few weeks. Those are not shoo-ins. And the Wildcats, they close the year. They're on bye this week, like everyone. Then they've got NAU, Idaho State, Idaho, Cal Poly. Not the easiest run of 4, especially that Idaho and potentially NAU matchup. But honestly, the Wildcats, Weber State makes me sad because this could be a very good team. It also makes me anxious because Idaho is going to have to show up against Weber State. But hey, we're done talking about the bottom half of the conference. So now let's look at the stories for the rest of the conference. I already talked playoffs for Montana State, UC Davis, and then what are we looking at with Montana and Idaho for playoffs? Because they're not 100% in, but there's if the season ended today, Montana and Idaho would both be in the playoffs for sure. So if we're looking at the rest of the conference, who are we paying attention to? Let's talk Sacramento State, the other side of that 51-48 game that I went on for a little bit. Sacramento State, they sit at 3-4 on the season. They picked up their first Big Sky win in that double overtime win. And that game may at least given Sacramento State a chance to salvage playoff hopes this season. I think they're the best shot of another team to squeak into the playoffs. Because look, they sit at 1-2 in conference, 3-4 on the season. All of Sacramento State's wins are FCS wins. And they've got 5 games left. Now, no way does Sacramento State run the table because of those 5 games, look, it's Idaho State, Portland State, Montana State, Cal Poly, UC Davis. And you can hear those last 3 weeks of Montana State, Cal Poly, UC Davis. Ignore Cal Poly. Sacramento State gets to take on the top 2 teams in the conference. Now, I think there's a pretty big gap between UC Davis and Montana. I mean, as an Idaho fan, I left the Idaho UC Davis game thinking Idaho gave that away multiple times. I left the Montana State game thinking that's a pretty damn good football team. But Sacramento State, they've kind of been all over the place. They've been anemic offensively until in Big Sky play until lighting up Weber State for 51 points. Now, if you're a Hornet, you got to hope that that's a sign of things to come. You have to hope that is a sign that Sacramento State, who like their other 2 conference losses are NAU and Eastern, not catastrophes, but if you're a team that started as high as Sacramento State did this season, that is disappointing. So you got to hope that in that Weber game, Carson Conklin throws 3 touchdowns, 357 yards, and Elijah Tautz Oliver rushes 19 times for 141 yards and 3 touchdowns. that maybe, and hey, also a wide receiver, Anderson Grover had himself a game, 8 catches for 136 yards, 2 touchdowns. Tal Tolliver also 11 catches for 85 yards. You have to hope, if you're a Hornet, that this game was Andy Thompson figuring out how to make this team work, which is rely as heavily as you possibly can on Elijah Tolliver. And maybe this means Carson Conklin, who is young, who redshirt freshman. You got to hope that Conklin has put it together in a way he hadn't been terrible in the last, earlier in the season by any means. But, Sacramento State, Carson Conklin was not the day one starter. That was Caden Bennett. The team's had a little bit of issue identifying who they are offensively. If Sac's going to make the playoffs, you have to say, hey, this week was the week the Hornets did figure out who they are offensively. And you also got to hope for a little bit of luck. And I say that playoff-wise. Their playoff hopes are not done. But if you want to be safely in the playoffs, this season you need 8 wins. In a 12-game season, you got to have 8 wins. If you got 7 wins heading into Selection Sunday, your fate is not 100% in your control. Sac State has to win out to get to 8 wins, and they've got Montana State and Davis. However, if Sac State can win 4 out of 5 and pick up a win over Montana State or Davis in there, that's how maybe the Hornets can survive being on that playoff bubble. But I think playoff bubble is who Sacramento State legitimately is. On paper, you'd say, hey, you think they're probably going to burst that bubble without, on paper, losing to Montana State and Davis. But I don't think Davis is invincible. I think Montana State and the Big Sky is pretty damn close to invincible. But Davis is not. So that's the interesting part about Sacramento State. Let's look at the rest of the conference now. And we're only focusing on 4 teams of Idaho, Montana State, and UC Davis. And first off, look, Montana was on a bye. I covered Idaho early, the Idaho game, a close win at Cal Poly. But let's look at Idaho and Montana kind of together, because both of them, they're the yin to each other's yang. They're the two teams could complete, if they could join, they would be one complete team. And that Idaho, they're a very strong defensive team. They're beat to hell with injuries. Hey, a lot of teams have injuries. Idaho's got kind of a different level of injuries. Like their top 4 defensive backs are all injured, potentially out of commission. Kind of a big deal on the defensive side of the ball, right? Down to 3rd string running back, down to a 3rd string quarterback right now. If Idaho can get through Eastern Washington this week, and that's where I'm going to start talking about some of the games this week. Sacramento State, they have Idaho State. Look, Sac State's got to win that if they're going to make the playoffs. Idaho State, they're not an easy out. They're kind of a weird matchup. Now, Idaho hosts Eastern Washington, and this is kind of a huge game for Idaho because Idaho's on bye in 2 weeks. So the first weekend games in November, that's when Idaho's on bye. If Idaho can get through Eastern Washington, there's a chance starting quarterback Jack Lane returns against Eastern. If he returns, now we might not be talking about Idaho as an incomplete team that's very strong defensively, especially against the run. Idaho's been great against the run the entire year. They were a little bit more effective getting to the quarterback earlier. Some of that's injuries. The way they've been susceptible on the defensive side of the ball is teams that have a quarterback who can throw underneath and try to pick apart some of the gaps in zone coverages at times. That's how teams can move the ball through the air against Idaho. Like, hey, UC Davis had some success with Miles Hastings doing that. Bo Kelly for Cal Poly actually did very well throwing the ball short intermediate passes, mostly underneath, down in the middle of the field. That's where Cal Poly was effective, especially in that first half. That's kind of where Idaho's been more likely to be susceptible. No team who's not Montana State has been able to run on Idaho. That counts Davis and maybe league best running back Len Larson. But Jack Lane back at quarterback, that could be the answer to Idaho's issues offensively, because offensively, even off scoring 34 points this last week against Cal Poly, the Vandals are the 2nd worst scoring offense in Big Sky play, scoring 22.5 points a game. That's low. That's just a team that doesn't score that well. Montana, they're the other side, where the Grizz, they can score the ball absolutely fine. They lead the conference, scoring 43.7 points per game. The downside is the Grizz are giving up 41 points a game. So kind of funny to think for Montana and Idaho that this season, or you want to call it ironic, go ahead, call it ironic, those two teams are the inverse of what you would think their coach's reputation would bring you. Like, hey, Crewhead 76 saying Vandals have to be good enough against the pass this week. Hope Lane and RBs are back. Yeah, correct. 100% their Crewhead 76. But the identity of Idaho and Montana, completely opposite of what their coaches are. Just funny thing about that. You know, Bobby Hauck, famously a defensive special teams coach, they're scoring 43 points and giving up 41 points. Jason Eck, offensive coordinator, former offensive line coach. That's why he got the job in the first place. Then his first 2 years at Idaho, they're known as an offense first team, rightly or wrongly. That's how they're known. And Idaho, 2024 Idaho, their strength is defense. You know, giving up 28 points per game in Big Sky play, but that's off a lot of injuries and having played both Montana State and UC Davis and at the time ranked NAU. So the toughest conference schedule in my mind. Doing fine on the defensive side of the ball, but just not putting up enough offensively. That's just reality. And again, now talking about Idaho again, with that schedule that I brought up, they're the number 3 total defense in the Big Sky. So that's just who those teams are. Kind of ironic to think of how those teams have landed in with the identities they do. Some of it's injury, some of it's luck, some of it's just, hey, these guys are 19 to 20-something-year-old kids, and sometimes things change. For Idaho, the big deal, like Crewhead 76 said, when Jack Lane gets back, if that's this week against Eastern, great. Also, if Idaho could get through this week without Lane and then have the bye, you'd got to feel pretty good about Jack Lane finishing out those final 3 games of the season for Idaho. Montana has Northern Colorado this week. Honestly, not a lot of drama there because Northern Colorado can't score. So this may be one of those weeks for Montana to pump those defensive numbers up a little bit. But I do want to spend a second talking about Montana. Look, Logan Fife, who was not the starter exactly to start the season out. Right now, he's the number 2 passer in Big Sky Conference play. In 3 games, he's thrown 8 touchdowns. He's also rushed for a few touchdowns, thrown for 302 yards per game. The Fife, a transfer out of Fresno State into Montana. So, no, he's been delivering. And then running back Eli Gilman, averaging 84.7 yards per game. But check this the number to pay attention to. 6.9 yards per rush for Gilman. That's good. Now, I'm not counting guys who don't actually rush that much. You're talking about running backs who get the ball a bit. That's comparable to guys like Scott Trey Humphrey at Montana State and Damon Bankson. And shockingly, honestly, Nick Ostmo is averaging 7.3 yards per rush on the ground for Montana. So the two-headed monster in the backfield of Eli Gilman and Nick Ostmo doing a lot of work on the ground for the Grizz. We all know Junior Bergen is one of the more dynamic dudes in conference as both a kick returner, punt returner, and wide receiver. So the Grizz have weapons and they can do quite a bit of damage, but they have not really been able to stop anyone whatsoever. So Crewhead 76 saying Montana got lucky getting Fife. You know what, Crewhead? Yeah, there's a lot of schools who would love to have a transfer from a school like Fresno State, Logan Fife, who's been able to deliver through the air and on the ground. I can think, I'm an Idaho fan. I would kill to have Logan Fife have been in the quarterback room for Idaho right now to push Jack Lane or take over as a starter when Jack Lane went down with that broken collarbone. However, if Fife was in Idaho, he probably would have been victim to the whatever curse the Vandals have had, where if quarterbacks get touched, their collarbones are going to have some issues because there's two quarterbacks who broken collarbones already for Idaho. Nick Joseph is the other. He started the year as number 3 quarterback, worked his way up to the number 2 quarterback, started against Montana State, but now the original number 2 quarterback, Jack Wagner, who became the number 3 quarterback after Joseph took his spot. He was a starter this last week, had his best game of the season, I feel, but Cal Poly is a team that'll often let teams have their best games this season. So take that for what it's worth. Final thing I want to talk about. And before I talk about that, hey, got to tell you, Hughes River Expeditions, they've been supporting Tubbs of the Club for a long time. And if you're looking for a great all-inclusive week-long vacation, don't look past your backyard. Hughes River Expeditions has been Vandal-owned and operated since 1976 and are ready to take you on the vacation of a lifetime. Enjoy a multi-day trip down the Middle Fork of the Salmon, the main Salmon River of no return, the Salmon River Canyons, or the Selway, and check out special trips like the one to see the Perseid meteor shower. Camp on pristine beaches, run amazing whitewater, hike scenic trails, spot wildlife, soak in beautiful natural hot springs, and fish some of the most remote stretches of river in the country. You just bring your clothes, let HRE handle the rest. So give them a call right now at 406-540-4450 or check them out at hughesriver.com. I got to talk about the top of the conference. And I gave a little bit of my feelings away early about Montana State, UC Davis. Now, those two teams are, we'll see where the polls come out. Montana State they were number 3. North Dakota State beat South Dakota State by 4 points early. We don't know if that'll change the polls. If anything, Montana State might move up a teeny bit. But the Bobcats have a pretty damn complete team. They're strong and much more aggressive this year on the defensive side of the ball. You know they're going to run over everyone. They've got a great O-line. Scott-Trey Humphrey has been fantastic in the backfield for them. They're keeping Tommy Mellott upright, which also makes Tommy Mellott more of a deep play threat. There's a ton going well if you're a Bobcat. And I bring that up to say UC Davis and Montana State have identical Big Sky Conference records. 4-0. The Bobcats are 8-0 on the season. UC Davis sits at 7-1 with a loss to Cal as their one loss. So question is, those are the top 2 of the conference. How close do I think those 2 teams are to each other? I don't think it's very close. I think that I think this is Montana State's conference. I think it should be. Look, the Bobcats do have their schedule is a little bit rougher to close out the season. They're on bye this week, like half the conference. Their final 4 games are Eastern Washington, Sacramento State, UC Davis, Montana. So look, Eastern's not going to make the playoffs, but they're not a talent-free team. Sac State's playing for their playoff lives. And then Davis and Montana, you understand those all as being those are playoff teams right now. I gotta say though, I mean, Idaho's played both teams, and Idaho's just one team. So take from this what you will. Yeah, this is me being a little bit of a homer, using my homer experience to talk about this. Montana State is complete. They can pass the ball. Yeah, they don't want Tommy Mellott passing, more than around 20-ish times a game. But look, Mellott is completing 68% of his passes in Big Sky play, and he's thrown 10 touchdowns. So in spite of whatever limitations you want to say Mellott has, he's playing pretty damn well. 10 touchdowns and no picks while completing 68% of his passes. It is very hard to do better than that. The one guy who is doing better is Miles Hastings. Miles Hastings, 14 touchdowns, 1 pick, completing 74% of his passes. Incredible. We talked about this on Tubs of the Club on the podcast rankings. Miles Hastings had been kind of up and down the last couple years. In 2022, he was great. 2023 is kind of took a half step back. Nope, Hastings is taking a step up. He has been absolutely great for UC Davis on this season. So, yeah, that's maybe the one edge you'd say. I'd say that you can maybe give to Davis is they have a better pure passer at quarterback in Miles Hastings than Mellott. But the gap between those two, I don't think is that much. And I think the gap between what Montana State does defensively and what their O-line can do to set up running lanes for. Look, I talked about Scott-Trey Humphrey as a back. He's the lead back for Montana State. He's got 125 carries. No one, the next closest back has 72 carries. That's Adam Jones. But Adam Jones is good, guys. He could be the number 1 running back in a lot of Big Sky schools. Between Scott-Trey Humphrey, Adam Jones, and Tommy Mellott, that's 22 rushing touchdowns. The Bobcats they have absolute talent carrying the ball, but their O-line is, I'm jealous, man. As a Vandal, I'm jealous. So Idaho's O-line's been a step above what they were last season, but Montana State is nationally elite. So how would I actually split apart the conference? This is Montana State's conference. They're going to lose, I think, at max 1 conference game this year. Honestly, I don't think they're going to lose a conference game because I think they're better than Davis. And I think they're a terrible matchup for Montana this year because Montana can't stop anyone defensively. So no, I think that this is Montana State's conference. The delineation I'd give is Montana State is a step above the next tier. And that tier, LaCrew 76 says Davis, Idaho are 2A, 2B. Honestly, I think Davis, Idaho, and Montana are all different. They're all about the same, and the matchup is what's going to matter, and who shows up is what's going to matter. Already brought up, Idaho and Montana are just the inverse of each other. However, the math changes if Idaho can get a league average offense. If Idaho has a league average offense, I'd put them as the second best team in the conference. But until Jack Lane's back and you see him deliver, he hasn't done that, so you can't quite say that. With that said, I think Davis, they kind of split the difference between Idaho and Montana. They're better defensively for sure than Montana because who isn't? They're not. I don't think they're as strong defensively as Idaho. Now they absolutely have talent on the offensive side of the ball. Davis does. That, like I said, best quarterback in the league, maybe best running back in the league, but their offensive line is not what it had been the last few years. It's definitely a step below something like Montana State. And early in the season, Idaho was able to really snuff out the run against Davis. So I have less faith in Davis. I think Davis is slightly outperforming their record, but they're still a very good team. They're around number 6 in the nation. That's very good. They're playing to host playoff games, 100% on the table. And they're through Idaho. They've got Montana State, Sac State still. So look, there are some tough games left for Davis, but that's how I understand this. Is tier 1 is Montana State by themselves. Bit of a gap between tier 2, where we're talking Idaho. Honestly, I'll be honest. And if you want to say this is me just being an Idaho homer, go ahead. When Jack Lane comes back, Idaho's at the top of this pile. When Jack Lane's not back, you got to say Davis beat Idaho head to head. So you put Davis barely first, and Idaho, Montana are kind of neck and neck with each other because they're mirror opposites of what the others do. Then you got the rest of the conference. Didn't talk NAU today that much. Ty Pennington's back. It makes him dangerous, but NAU is not going to make the playoffs. It's not possible with that win early in the year over Lincoln, non-D1 win. Scheduling kind of sucks, but that's the basic way to understand the season is in a 12-game season, you want to shoe in as a Big Sky team, be shoe in the playoffs. You got to get to 8 wins, and throwing away a game against a non-D1 team like NAU schedule had them do, it kills your margin for error. I'm a vandal. I've been there. But hey, that's the podcast. That's the power rankings this week. Support the show, Tubbs the Club. Support Tubbs the Club at patreon.com/Tubbs the Club. Join the hashtag OnlyTubbs Discord. Best place on the internet to talk Idaho sports. But it's active and talks Big Sky stuff all week, guys. Yeah, it's Idaho flavored, but you want to support the show, you can do it for as little as $2.50 a month. You want to do it for more, go ahead. You like what we're doing here, you can always Venmo us at Tubbs at the Club as well. So yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. Thanks for coming this week. It's kind of a weird week. Patty couldn't quite make it, so hey, that part slightly disappointing, but Patty very well may be back next week. And whenever Patty's back, it'll be great to have him. Crew at 76 saying, go Vandals. Thanks, Brian. I just want to say, hey, get on my soapbox for 1 second, guys. We got 5 weeks of Big Sky football left, man. Just enjoy it while it's here. The season goes by in a blink. Next week, we're going to talk thematically a little bit different because once you start to get into late October, the games are serious, and they're serious in different ways because your team's playing for different things and everything matters. Look, I've been there on the rough teams. I can talk to you about what it's been like to be in those late October, early November games when the playoffs are done and you're trying to figure out why you're here, why you're at the game, what does it matter? Well, or you're like Idaho now, and Idaho essentially needs to win out to make the playoffs. Idaho needs to win out to host in the playoffs. Sacramento State needs to win out to make the playoffs. Montana, they have a schedule that's helped them out, but they've got to figure out how they're going to stop teams or they're going to be out of the playoffs pretty damn quick. All these things matter. We'll talk about how to understand thematically the change post Halloween for Big Sky Conference football teams. But thanks for coming here. And as always, for me, go Vandals. If you're saying go somewhere else, you're a Davis listener, you're a Montana listener, you can say whatever you want there, man. This is a full-time Big Sky Conference show. I love the conference. It's been fun as hell to watch. It's just been wild to me the way some of these games have shaken out. But again, thank you everyone for showing up tonight. I will talk to you next week. Go Vandals.